It all went down on my father's 60th birthday, right there in front of more than 50 people crammed into our family's grand living room. The chandeliers glowed, champagne flutes sparkled, and for a brief moment, it actually felt like we were celebrating something real, something that mattered. Then my father smirked, lifted his glass, and with that familiar hint of cruelty in his voice, said, "You're adopted, Nathan, so I removed your name from my will." The whole room burst into laughter. Some of my relatives were nearly doubled over, clapping each other on the back like it was the best joke they'd heard all night. My younger brother, Daniel, laughed the loudest, that smug grin of his aimed straight at me. My sister, Grace, shook her head with a look of fake pity, leaned toward a cousin, and whispered something that made them both laugh even harder. My father just stood there soaking it all in, feeding off the attention, enjoying every second of the humiliation. The only person not laughing was my mother, Margaret. She sat frozen in her chair, her hands gripping the edge of the tablecloth like she was bracing against a storm. Her eyes found mine, full of silent apology, but she didn't say a word. She never did when he was like that. She never challenged him in public, not even when I was the one being torn apart. I stood there for a moment, staring at them all. My chest burned, but it wasn't shame. It was something sharper. They thought I'd just stand there, red-faced and humiliated, maybe even walk out. Instead, I started walking forward. Each step was slow and deliberate. The laughter began to fade as I reached the long banquet table where all the gifts were laid out. Without a word, I placed mine on the polished wood. It wasn't wrapped in fancy paper or tied with a ribbon, just a plain white envelope. Dozens of eyes followed me as I slid it into the center of the table, then tore it clean in half. The sound of ripping paper cut through the silence. I kept tearing until all that was left were small scraps scattered across the tablecloth. Then I stepped back and just stood there, calm, while confusion started spreading through the room like smoke. My father barked. What the hell was that? His voice carried that false confidence he always used when he felt the ground slipping. The same people who'd been laughing seconds earlier now stared at the shredded paper, their amusement replaced by curiosity. I met his eyes and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "That was my gift to you." I paused, letting the words sink in. I grew up in a house where wealth wasn't just about money. It was about pride, appearances, and bloodlines. My father, Robert, had built his entire reputation on those things. To the outside world, he was a self-made man, a sharp businessman who'd built an empire through grit and clever deals. But to me, he was just the man who never let me forget that I wasn't really his son. When I was younger, I tried not to notice the difference in how he treated me versus my siblings. Daniel, 2 years younger, had inherited his jawline and that same confident stride. Grace, 3 years older, had his sly smile and his ability to own a room without saying much. They were his pride and joy. He loved showing them off at parties, bragging about their successes, predicting their bright futures. But with me, it was always different. He never introduced me as his son, and when he did, he'd always slip in the word adopted, like it was a disclaimer. At family dinners, he'd skip over anything I accomplished, even when I'd worked twice as hard as Daniel and Grace combined. When I earned a scholarship to college, he congratulated me with the same tone he used when thanking a waiter for refilling his glass. My mother, Margaret, was the only steady thing in that house. Gentle, quiet, always trying to soften his blows. She wasn't my biological mother either, but she never let me feel like an outsider. When I was little, she'd sneak into my room at night, sit on the edge of my bed, and whisper, "You're mine, Nathan. Blood doesn't decide family." Those words carried me through years of being ignored, mocked, and made to feel like I didn't belong. Still, it cut deep. Every time my father beamed at Daniel's stupid jokes or raised a glass to Grace's latest award, while I sat invisible at the same table. By the time I hit my 30s, I'd stopped expecting anything from him. I built my own career, invested smartly, and carved out a life that had nothing to do with his money or name. I didn't want his fortune. I just wanted an ounce of his respect, a sign that maybe, finally, I'd proven myself. When the invitation for his 60th birthday showed up, I almost tossed it aside. It was written in Grace's elegant handwriting, embossed in gold, dripping with the kind of excess that defined every Cole gathering. The party was at the family estate, that mansion he built as a monument to himself. The guest list was full of extended relatives, old business partners, and family friends. It wasn't just a birthday, it was a show. I hesitated, until Margaret called me herself. "Please come, Nathan," she said softly. "It would mean the world to me. Your father, he's set in his ways, but you're still his son, no matter what he says. Just be there for me." Her voice carried a kind of sadness I couldn't ignore. She'd been my protector for as long as I could remember, and if she asked this of me, I'd do it. I promised myself I'd stay calm, no matter what happened. On the day of the party, I showed up early. The house was already alive when I arrived, chandeliers glowing like captured stars, waiters gliding smoothly across the polished floors with trays of champagne, and laughter drifting from every corner. I walked down the hallway lined with portraits of my father, Robert, oil paintings of him shaking hands with politicians, standing proudly in front of his first company, and smiling beside Daniel and Grace at family milestones. Not one photo on those walls included me. Not a single one. Margaret met me at the door. She pulled me into a tight hug, and that familiar lavender scent wrapped around me like home. "You look handsome," she said warmly, straightening my tie the way she used to when I was a kid getting ready for school. Behind her, I could see Robert holding court near the bar with Daniel. His booming laugh filled the room, loud and commanding. Grace stood nearby, champagne in hand, scanning the crowd with those sharp, calculating eyes of hers. Always watching, always judging. Margaret leaned in and whispered, "Promise me, Nathan, don't let him get under your skin tonight. Just smile, nod, and let the evening pass." For me. I nodded, even though I knew deep down it wouldn't be that easy. My father always found a way to make me the target. That was the role he'd written for me in this ongoing family performance. And he never missed his cue. The night moved on in a blur of polite conversation and empty compliments. I shook hands with distant relatives who barely remembered my name and listened to their hollow words about how great I looked. The air carried the scent of roasted lamb and expensive wine, but underneath it all was something sour, the stench of power, control, and pretense. This wasn't a birthday celebration. It was Robert's stage, and we were all extras in his show. Inside my jacket pocket, I could feel the small envelope I'd brought, my gift for him. It wasn't wrapped in gold foil or tied with a ribbon like the luxury watches and fine wine stacked high on the gift table. Mine was simple, modest, but infinitely more valuable. I'd chosen it carefully, not out of obligation, but out of respect. For all his cruelty, part of me still wanted to give him something that mattered. Watching him laugh with his friends, basking in the glow of his own ego, I felt the envelope press against my chest like a weight I couldn't ignore. I didn't know it then, but that single piece of paper would soon turn his perfect world upside down, right there, in front of everyone who worshipped him. After dinner, the speeches began. The clinking of silverware faded, waiters cleared the plates, and the room settled into expectant silence. Everyone knew what was coming. My father never passed up an opportunity to command a crowd. He stood at the head of the long banquet table, glass raised high, chest puffed out as if the night itself existed to honor him. He tapped his glass gently, and the murmurs stopped instantly. 60 years, he began, his voice full of confidence, the kind of tone that comes from a lifetime of being listened to. 60 years of hard work, of building a family, of creating a legacy worth remembering. Polite applause followed. A few guests lifted their glasses, smiling as though they were in the presence of greatness. Daniel leaned back in his chair, grinning, proud to be sitting at his father's side. Grace placed a hand on his shoulder, her face glowing like she was basking in reflected glory. Margaret sat stiffly, her smile brittle, beautiful, but fragile, like glass about to crack. My father's speech rolled on, filled with the usual stories, his early business struggles, the deals that made him rich, the lessons he claimed to have taught his children. Each line drew another wave of forced laughter and approving nods. Then his tone shifted. He lowered his glass slightly, his lips curling into that familiar smirk. "But what is legacy?" he said, drawing out the words, "without blood?" A hush fell over the room. The words were sharp, deliberate, a blade disguised as a toast. "A man's legacy belongs to his children," he continued. "Those who carry his name, his spirit, and most importantly, his blood." Around the table, heads nodded. Smiles widened. People murmured their agreement. My stomach tightened, I knew exactly where he was going. Then he turned toward me, eyes locking onto mine like a hunter cornering his prey. And that, he said slowly, brings me to a decision I've made. He paused, savoring the silence, the anticipation, before driving the knife in. My adopted son, Nathan, will not be included in my will. Legacy cannot be passed through paperwork. It must run in the blood. For a split second, the room went dead quiet. Then the laughter hit, loud, cruel, and echoing off the high ceilings. Some guests chuckled behind their glasses. Others slapped the table as if it were the funniest thing they'd ever heard. Daniel laughed hardest, leaning over to clap our father on the back. "Good one, Dad," he said loudly. "About time you made it clear." Grace just smirked, shaking her head like she'd known all along this was coming. Heat rushed to my face, not from shame, but from anger, pure and steady. I sat there, fists clenched under the table, watching them laugh. Laugh at my life. Laugh at every year I'd spent trying to prove I belonged in that family. They wanted me broken. They wanted me small. Only Margaret didn't laugh. She sat motionless, her hand gripping the stem of her wine glass, so tight I thought it might snap. Her eyes shimmered with tears she refused to let fall. When she looked at me, her expression was a mix of heartbreak and apology, silently pleading with me not to lose control. But inside me, a storm was breaking. Every insult, every dismissal, every moment my father had introduced me as the adopted one instead of his son, they all came flooding back at once. This was his final act, his public declaration that I didn't belong, and he wanted an audience for it. The laughter grew louder, filling the ornate room until it became a cruel kind of music. A few guests looked uneasy, but none of them dared to stay quiet, not in front of Robert. That was the power he had over them, the fear he thrived on. And in that moment, I caught the eye of an old family friend, a man who had known me since I was a boy. The old family friend met my eyes for a second, then quickly looked away, ashamed, as if he'd been caught enjoying the show. I could have left right then. That would have been the easiest thing to do. Just walk out, leave them to their little celebration of bloodlines and money, let them think they'd finally pushed me aside for good. But something inside me wouldn't let me. No, not tonight. I wasn't leaving quietly. I pushed my chair back and stood. The sound of the chair legs scraping the floor cut through the laughter, and one by one, the voices died out. The room fell still as I started walking toward the long banquet table, where the gifts sat gleaming under the soft light. My footsteps echoed in the sudden hush. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Even Daniel stopped laughing, his smirk slipping into something closer to confusion. My father raised his chin, pretending to be unbothered, but I caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "And where do you think you're going?" he called out, his tone still mocking, but thinner now, strained beneath the silence pressing down on the room. I didn't answer. My focus was on the small envelope in my hand, the gift I'd brought for him. Plain, unwrapped, nothing fancy, but worth more than anything else in that room. I placed it carefully in the center of the table. The faint sound of paper touching wood echoed louder than it should have. Every eye followed me as I straightened. Then, without a word, I held the envelope up for everyone to see and tore it clean in half. Gasps broke the silence. I kept tearing, splitting the paper again and again until the scraps fluttered down like snow, scattering across the glossy tablecloth. When I finished, I let the last pieces fall from my hands and turned to face my father. The laughter was gone now, replaced by a low hum of whispers. Robert's smirk had disappeared. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed, searching my face for an answer. "What was that?" he demanded, voice sharp and uneasy. "What the hell did you just tear up in front of everyone?" I met his stare, steady and calm. The first time in my life I'd ever felt completely unafraid of him. "That," I said clearly enough for everyone to hear, "was my gift to you." A heavy silence settled over the room. The same people who'd been laughing a minute ago now leaned forward, their curiosity overtaking their cruelty. My father's face hardened, but behind that practiced mask, I saw the cracks beginning to form. He didn't yet realize what he'd lost, but he would. The scraps of my gift still lay scattered across the table, twitching slightly from the faint hum of the air conditioning. The chandeliers above buzzed softly, the only sound left in the room. I could feel their eyes on me, wide, confused, nervous. The air was thick, the weight of anticipation pressing down like a storm about to break. Then my father spoke again, slower this time. Nathan, he said, his voice lower, uncertain now. What did you just do? His expression had changed, no longer smug, no longer in control. His forehead creased, his mouth tightened into a thin line, and for the first time that evening, he looked unsure of himself. I stood tall and let him sit in the discomfort for a moment before answering. I gave you my gift, I said evenly, and I made sure you could never keep it. A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Heads turned, whispers filled the corners. People shifted uneasily, hungry to understand what I'd just said. Daniel leaned forward, forcing a laugh to cover his nerves. Oh, please, he sneered. What could you possibly give that would matter here? Dad doesn't need anything from you. Grace chimed in, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. Pathetic, she said, tilting her head. Even on his birthday, you find a way to make it about yourself. I didn't even look at them. They'd always been his shadows, feeding off his approval, echoing his cruelty like an audience that never tired of the act. My words weren't for them. They were for him. Robert took a slow step toward the table, eyes fixed on the pile of torn paper. When he spoke again, his voice tried to sound commanding, but a faint tremor betrayed him. Pick that up, he ordered, and explain yourself. Right now. I shook my head. No, Dad. His eyes narrowed. You wanted to make a show of me tonight, I said. You wanted to prove I don't belong, to humiliate me in front of the people who matter to you most. I paused, letting the silence stretch. But what you don't realize, I continued, is that I came prepared. Gasps rippled through the room. A woman near the back covered her mouth. Someone else whispered urgently to the person beside them. The atmosphere had changed. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was confrontation, and nobody dared look away. Margaret's eyes glistened with tears as she reached toward me, her hand trembling. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She'd spent her whole life keeping the peace. But she knew something in me had finally shifted. Robert's jaw tightened. Prepared for what? He demanded, his voice low, clipped. I met his gaze without blinking. Prepared for you, I said. Prepared for this night. You can laugh, I went on, my voice steady. You can cut me out of your will, you can talk about bloodlines all you want, but you can't erase what I just destroyed. A fresh wave of murmurs rolled through the crowd. Daniel frowned, his earlier confidence slipping. What was in that envelope? He asked, his voice quieter now. I let the silence hang, long enough to let them all feel it. The unease spread like wildfire. My father's friends, once laughing and clapping, now leaned forward in their chairs. The same men who had toasted his success now looked unsure, uneasy. Even his business partners, those who had always bowed to him, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Because they could sense it too, the balance of power in that room had just changed. He looked away fast, embarrassed that I'd caught him enjoying the show. I could have walked out right then. That would have been the simple choice. Let them keep toasting their wealth and pretending I didn't exist. Let them think they'd finally pushed me out for good. But something in me hardened instead of breaking. I wasn't going to slip away quietly, not tonight. I shoved my chair back and stood. The laughter died down as I started walking toward the banquet table where all the gifts were piled high. Each step I took echoed through the room. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Even Daniel stopped grinning, watching me with a puzzled look. My father lifted his chin, trying to look relaxed, but I caught the flicker of doubt behind his eyes. And where exactly are you going? He called, still trying for that mocking tone, but it sounded thinner now, stretched tight by the silence blanketing the room. I didn't answer. My focus was on the small envelope I held, my gift for him. It wasn't fancy, no ribbon or decoration, but it carried more worth than anything else on that table. I laid it down gently in the center. The soft scrape of paper against the wood sounded loud in the stillness. Dozens of eyes tracked my every move. Then, without a word, I lifted the envelope high so everyone could see it, and tore it straight down the middle. Gasps rippled through the room. I kept going, ripping the pieces smaller and smaller until bits of paper drifted down like snow across the polished table. When I finished, I let the shreds fall from my hands and turned to face my father again. The laughter was gone now, replaced by confused whispers. Robert's smirk had vanished. His jaw clenched tight, his eyes narrowing like he was trying to make sense of what I'd just destroyed. What was that? He demanded, his voice sharp now, tinged with fear. What the hell did you just tear up in front of everyone? I met his stare, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of him. That, I said, my voice clear enough for the whole room to hear, was my gift to you. The silence that followed felt heavy. The same people who had laughed at me minutes earlier were now leaning forward, trying to figure out what they'd just seen. My father's face stiffened, but I could see the cracks forming beneath it. He didn't yet understand what he'd lost, but he would soon. The torn scraps fluttered faintly in the air conditioning, scattered across the table like dead leaves. Every eye in the room was on me now, some wide with shock, others squinting in suspicion. The air had gone still. The easy laughter that had filled the house earlier was gone, replaced by a suffocating quiet. Finally, my father spoke. "Nathan," he said, his tone lower now, stripped of its arrogance. "What did you just do?" The smugness was gone. His forehead creased, his mouth tightening as confusion bled into doubt. I stood tall, letting him stew in that uncertainty. "I gave you my gift," I said evenly, "and I made sure you could never keep it." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. People leaned in, whispering, shifting in their chairs. The air felt charged, restless. Daniel let out a forced laugh, trying to shake off the unease. "Please," he scoffed. "What could you possibly give that would matter here? Dad doesn't need anything from you." Grace smirked beside him, tilting her head with that same polished cruelty she'd practiced since childhood. "Pathetic," she said under her breath. "Even on Dad's birthday, you still have to make it about yourself." I ignored them. They'd always been his echo chamber, copying his tone, feeding off his approval. My words weren't for them. They were for him. Robert stepped closer to the table, his gaze fixed on the pile of shredded paper. "Pick that up," he barked, his voice trembling slightly despite his effort to sound commanding. "Explain yourself. Right now." I shook my head. "No, Dad. You wanted to prove to everyone that I don't belong here. You wanted to humiliate me in front of your friends." I took a breath, my voice steady. "But what you don't realize is, I came prepared." Gasps rippled through the room again. A woman in the back covered her mouth. Someone whispered something hurriedly to the person beside them. The mood had shifted. This wasn't amusement anymore. It was confrontation. Marion's eyes filled with tears. She reached a trembling hand toward me, but didn't speak. She'd spent years trying to keep the peace, but now she knew. Something in me had changed. Robert's jaw tightened. "Prepared for what?" he demanded. I met his gaze without flinching. "Prepared for you. For this night. You can laugh. You can cut me out of your will. You can tell the world blood is everything. But you can't undo what I just destroyed." Another wave of murmurs rippled through the guests. Daniel's smirk faltered as he turned toward our father, realizing something was off. "What was in that envelope?" he asked, his voice less sure now. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch, watching the tension coil tighter and tighter around the room. My father's friends, who had been laughing with him all night, now leaned forward, eyes wide, waiting to see the truth unravel. Even his business partners shifted in their seats, realizing this wasn't the show of dominance Robert had planned. It was something else entirely. Marion's eyes shimmered with tears as she reached out to me. She didn't say a word, but her face said everything: pride, sorrow, and relief all tangled together. Across the table, Robert's hands dropped the taped fragments. They scattered again, fluttering uselessly across the polished surface. His shoulders slumped, the energy draining out of him like air from a punctured balloon. He had spent his whole life believing power came from control, from money, bloodlines, and dominance. And in a single moment, I had torn that illusion to pieces. "You think this makes you strong?" he finally spat, though his voice shook with exhaustion. "You think tearing up a piece of paper changes anything?" "It changes everything," I said quietly, steady as stone. "Because that paper wasn't about money or property. It was proof that I still cared, even after everything you did. It was my way of saying I was still willing to stand beside you as your son. But you made sure the whole world saw how little that meant to you. So I took away the only thing that still meant something." The silence that followed was thick and crushing. My words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Daniel slammed his fist against the table, the sharp sound breaking the tension. "You ruined everything," he shouted. "Do you even realize what you've done to us?" I turned toward him, calm and unshaken. "I know exactly what I've done. I showed you that money doesn't buy loyalty, and blood doesn't guarantee love. You wanted me gone, erased from this family. But after tonight, you'll remember me every time you think about what your father lost." Grace didn't say a thing. She just sank back into her chair, her arms wrapping tightly around her body. The confidence she'd worn like armor was gone. Robert stood frozen, his eyes locked on the torn fragments of the deed. His face had gone pale, his hands limp at his sides. And for the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of me, fear of the truth. He'd built his entire world on control, on appearances and pride, and I had shattered it all in front of the people whose approval he worshipped. Guests began to stir. Some rose quietly, unwilling to linger in the ruins of the man they'd once admired. Others stayed seated, whispering, unsure what to say. A few glanced at me with something like respect, others with disbelief, but none of them looked at Robert the same way again. I turned toward the door, my decision final. "Happy birthday, Dad," I said, my voice calm, almost gentle. "Enjoy the gifts from the ones who laugh at your cruelty. Mine's gone, just like the respect you thought you still had." As I walked away, I heard chairs scrape, voices whisper, and then the dull thud of my father collapsing into his seat. The man who had once towered over everyone now looked small, powerless, and broken. I left the dining hall with my back straight and my steps steady. Behind me, the murmurs followed like a tide. The same people who had come to celebrate his dominance were now whispering about his downfall. The man who had mocked me, who had turned me into a joke in my own home, now sat pale and trembling before his entire world. I didn't look back. For the first time, I didn't need his reaction to justify what I'd done. In the foyer, the golden glow of the chandeliers spilled across the marble floors, but the house no longer felt grand or intimidating. It was just a building now, a hollow monument to Robert's ego. Then I heard soft footsteps behind me. Marion caught up and gently grabbed my arm. Her voice trembled, but her words were firm. "Nathan," she whispered, "I'm so proud of you. I wish it hadn't come to this, but you finally showed him who you really are." I turned to face her, the one person who had always been my anchor. "I didn't do it to hurt him, Mom," I said quietly. "I did it for myself, to let him see what he threw away." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "You've always been the strongest one," she said softly. "He just never had the courage to admit it." She pulled me into a hug, and I let myself hold on, not as the outcast anymore, but as her son, the one she had loved without conditions. When I stepped out into the night, the cool air hit my face like freedom. Behind me, the estate still gleamed with light, but the party inside was already falling apart. I knew the story would spread. People wouldn't remember the champagne or the expensive gifts. They'd remember Robert scrambling over scraps of paper, his pride unraveling before their eyes. In the days that followed, the phone calls started. Some relatives reached out, their voices thick with fake sympathy. "Nathan, you shouldn't have done that in front of everyone." One aunt scolded, as if my public humiliation had been fine, but my response was somehow unacceptable. I ended those calls quickly. I didn't need approval from anyone who'd laughed along with him. But others called with quiet respect. "You did what no one else could," one of my father's old business partners said. "You stood up to him. You made him human." They called it courage, but I hadn't done it for admiration. I'd done it for peace. And when peace proved impossible, truth was enough. Daniel kept his distance. From what I heard, he'd been raging ever since, furious that I'd cost him and Grace what he believed was rightfully theirs. To him, that deed wasn't just about money. It was about legacy. Another inheritance lost to the brother he'd never seen as equal. Grace sent only one message. It said, "You made your point. Don't come back here again." I smiled when I read it. I had no intention of returning. My father never called. Weeks passed, then months, nothing. His pride wouldn't allow him to reach out, not after what happened. He'd built his life on control, and I'd shattered that illusion in front of the only crowd that ever mattered to him. He'd rather live in silence than admit I'd beaten him at his own game. But one afternoon, Marion came by quietly. She brought a basket of fresh bread, just like she used to when I was a kid. Margaret sat at my kitchen table, her hands gently folded, her face carrying that bittersweet mix of sadness and calm. "He's not the same anymore," she said quietly. "Most nights he just sits in his study, staring at the walls. He doesn't yell, he doesn't rage, he's just smaller. It's like the weight of his own choices finally caught up with him." I didn't interrupt. I just listened. Part of me pitied him, but a bigger part knew his pain wasn't mine to shoulder. "He wanted me to be nothing," I said softly, but all he did was show the world exactly what kind of man he really is. Margaret reached across the table and took my hand. "You're more than his son, Nathan," she said. "You became your own man, and you proved it without shouting, without stooping to his cruelty. That's what sets you apart." Her words stayed with me long after she left. For years, I'd thought strength meant surviving his contempt, waiting for the day he'd finally see my worth. But real strength wasn't about waiting. It was about walking away from his shadow and building a life that didn't need his approval. With time, I poured myself into my work, expanding my businesses, creating opportunities for people like me, people who'd once been told they didn't belong. I started mentoring young men and women who'd been overlooked or dismissed, reminding them that family and worth aren't about bloodlines. They're about the choices we make and the character we build. Every time one of them found success, I felt a kind of pride my father could never understand. That night, the night everything changed, never truly left me. Sometimes I replayed it, not out of anger, but with clarity. I could still see the laughter, the smug grins of Daniel and Grace, the silence of guests who watched but said nothing. And I could still feel the exact moment it all shifted, when I stood firm and let my actions speak louder than their cruelty. The lesson from that moment carried me through life. Family isn't who shares your last name or who writes you into their will. Family is who stands beside you when the world turns its back. It's who loves you without condition and who respects you when others don't. I had that in Margaret, and I had that in myself. That was enough. When my father's next birthday came around, I didn't go. Instead, I spent the evening surrounded by the people I now called family, friends who saw me, valued me, and expected nothing in return. We laughed, we told stories, and for the first time in years, I felt light. No bitterness, no resentment, just peace. And as the candles burned low that night, I finally understood. Walking away wasn't losing. It was winning. Because the man who tried to erase me ended up empty, and I walked away free. That's the truth of what happened the night my father tried to make me disappear. He thought his words could break me, but all they did was release me. I left that house no longer craving his approval, no longer needing a place in his world. I finally understood that real strength isn't about being accepted by people who refuse to see your worth. It's about standing tall, even when the world tries to tear you down. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of something in your own life, I'd ask one thing. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment below. Tell me what family means to you, or share a time you chose yourself over someone else's cruelty. And if you'd like to hear more stories that speak straight from the heart, subscribe to this channel. Your support means more than you know, and it's what helps me keep telling stories that matter.